Hey nerds, what's up? So I always get asked a lot to clarify what I mean by different genres. What is grimdark? What separates epic from high fantasy? And I just thought, you know what? I'm just gonna get it all down on paper and just get it in one spot and define all these things for you guys. But as always, of course, I have some caveats. Sometimes I think in the fantasy fandoms, we view subgenre a little too rigidly. As humans, we often want to put everything into neat little boxes and describe everything perfectly, and just books aren't ever gonna really always be able to be fit in those kind of descriptors. It's important to remember that these subgenres are really there as a tool for the reader to maybe set expectations, maybe to help find things that they personally like, or to better, weed out from all of the books we have to choose from. It's important to remember that these are often labeled by reviewers or readers, and sometimes the author themselves might disagree with the label, or an author labels it as something and the readers disagree. These labels aren't perfect. Again, they're really just a tool to guide you to understand and set expectations. It's important to remember also that these subgenres often have many different definitions to the people that use them. There's a lot of discussion and argument about what each of these mean. So when I'm giving forward a definition today, I'm just trying to give a very high level basic definition. It's probably not going to match everybody's definitions, but just at least give you an idea of what people are talking about when they use the terms. So yes, this is going to give you a general sense of our subgenres, of what's out there, but let's not worry or overly focus too much on the labels we give the books. Because honestly, the subgenres are not really that big of a deal, in my opinion anyway. But anyway, let's get into it. We're going to start with the three largest, or at least the three terms I hear most often thrown about because they are very high level labels, which is high fantasy, epic fantasy, and low fantasy. So we've got high fantasy, which in general are books with lots of magic. These are books that are definitely going to have extreme magical elements in it, probably fantasy creatures, fantasy races. This is to the extreme. It is not our world. It looks nothing like our world. It is everything you could possibly think of fantasy. In contrast, low fantasy is the opposite. Low fantasy is something that doesn't have that many magical elements, or it might take place in a completely fictionalized world, but other than that, there's not much magic to be had. There might not be any magical creatures. It is something that is fictional, that isn't rooted in our real world just to be considered fiction, but also doesn't have a lot of magic. Two of the best examples I can think of is high fantasy is what you think of when you think of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Intense magic, new location, tons of fantasy creatures, tons of fantasy elements. Contrasted with a low fantasy like The First Law by Joe Abercrombie, which is in a completely different world, but especially even as the series goes on, pretty much no magic. The story revolves a lot more around other things. It's not magic, especially by the time you get to Age of Madness. Epic fantasy I find to be slightly more difficult to define because I feel like epic and high fantasy are often used synonymously, but I think where epic distinguishes itself is by length. Epic fantasy is usually considered fantasy with a lot of point of view characters, a lot of books, spanning perhaps a long period of time, or at least multiple characters and multiple books, and always deals with very world-ending, mass-scale plots. So when we think of epic fantasy, think of kind of those classic fantasies like The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. Obviously, epic and high obviously go together. It's just not every high fantasy is epic. But I would say most epic fantasies are high fantasy. It's like the square and rectangle thing. Okay, next I want to talk about four more labels that I think I see most regularly after those low, high, and epic broad ones. And there are four that you probably hear the most currently on BookTube, which would be urban, grimdark, cozy, and magical realism. Let's start with urban, which is, other than those top three, probably the one I hear the most about. Urban fantasy is fantasy that takes place in cities. But I will say there's usually a modernity to the term urban, because technically a lot of our medieval Europe stuff takes place in cities. But when we talk city, we're thinking more of kind of a skyscraper, kind of modern city. When I think of urban fantasy, I think of things like the Dresden Files or the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. Grimdark has been a huge buzzword for the last decade. I did a whole video on it if you want to go deeper into it. Grimdark is definitely one I feel like has been dominating our conversations for the last decade. And I feel like the term grimdark has kind of replaced dark fantasy. At least I don't hear just dark fantasy as much anymore. I usually hear grimdark. Anyway, grimdark are books that are dark. Shocker. but they usually are classified by having anti-heroes or all morally gray characters, no character that is good or trying to do good. It's classified by unhappy endings or at least mixed endings. Like, you don't necessarily think everyone's gonna have a happy time. And not always, but generally, I find them to be a little bit more explicit and violent than typical fantasy. There is a general lack of hope in grimdark. So you would see grimdark labeled for things like the Broken Empire trilogy by Mark Lawrence, the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, and A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Next, let's talk about cozy fantasy. Cozy is definitely a newer term to the scene that's all of a sudden shot up. Everyone's looking for cozy fantasy. Cozy fantasy is pretty much the opposite of grimdark, which is that it's all good people, it's all hopeful and warm and fuzzy, and most importantly, it is low stakes fantasy. We are not talking about the ending of the world. We are not talking about the forces of good and evil. These are low stakes. If you want to see a good classic opposite example, it would be looking at Good Omens Season 1 versus Good Omens Season 2. Good Omens Season 1, not cozy, deals with the fate of the world. Good Omens Season 2, all low stakes things. We're really talking about interpersonal relationships. Other famous cozy novels that have gone to prominence recently would be Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, and Small Miracles by Olivia Atwater, which was our SPFBO winner last year. And finally, we're gonna talk about magical realism. I didn't really know where to put this one in this video. I think magical realism can sometimes be just considered a genre unto itself, not even under the fantasy realm, even though it is. Magical realism is fantasy that is extremely rooted in our real world and usually only has one, maybe two fantastical elements. And a lot of time those fantastical elements can be considered like, are they really happening? Like, it's very, very little magic. Magical realism distinguishes itself from low fantasy in that magical realism has to be rooted in our world, whereas low fantasy often is in completely made up and fantasy worlds still. Whereas magical realism, again, it is very realistic. So examples of this would be A Wild Sheep Chase by Haruki Murakami, or many books by Murakami. He kind of writes magical realism a lot. The Titular Story in the Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu, Boy Snowbird by Helen Oyemi, or famously 100 Years of Solitude. Honestly, I love magical realism, so I have lots of recommendations there because I think it's a very fun genre. Next, I've got my self-explanatory section where I feel like the titles are pretty explanatory of what we mean, and those are historical fantasy, romantasy, and sci-fantasy. So again, starting with historical fantasy, I think it's pretty obvious. Historical fantasy is just real historical events in our world that have been put with fantasy elements. So it's like historical fiction, except there's a fantastical element to it. Historical fantasy looks like things like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. It looks like A Declaration for the Rights of Magicians by H.G. Perry. It looks like The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. Romantasy is fantasy with romance, except more like, I would say, romantic fantasy. It is where romance is the central plot. And then obviously it's in a fantasy world. Now, if you've been here a while, you'll know that I don't read romantasy at all. It's just not my thing. So I don't have as many like good notes of what the popular books are. I'm gonna guess anything by Sarah J. Maas probably falls under romantasy, and like the Ice Planet Barbarian books are probably, just from what I've heard, romantasy. Finally, sci-fantasy. This one is sci-fi mixed with fantasy. I feel like this one's a little contentious because there are a lot of people who feel like if there's any sci-fi elements, then it is clearly sci-fi, whereas if there's any fantasy elements, it is clearly fantasy. It's often hard for people to kind of separate what makes fantasy and sci-fi. I always say science fiction is rooted in science. Duh, I get it. But it's things that could happen. It's much more looking for explanations in the real world of how it could potentially happen. Really dealing with space. It also often is dealing with technology and its effects on our world, where fantasy is much more unexplained magic that's not trying to be explained. Now, the classic sci-fantasy is actually Star Wars, because we have the Force, which is clearly a magical thing, but we also have spaceships and light travel and the universe in a way that is very rooted in sci-fi. Okay, and finally, we're gonna do a speed round of a bunch of lesser mentioned subgenres, but I still seen them get thrown around, and so you might just kind of want to know what they mean in general. Let's start with flintlock. Flintlock is anything with guns. It just means fantasy with which gunpowder has been invented, since so much fantasy usually takes place with just like swords and arrows. Famous examples include the Powder Mage trilogy by Brian McClellan, or the Shadow Campaigns by Django Wexler. Another one is hopepunk. Now, hopepunk is one of the newest coined terms that I've seen, and I don't really feel like it's gaining traction, but hopepunk was coined as a direct response to grimdark, so it's the opposite of that. It is things filled with hope and light and happiness and good characters. I personally feel like we use the term cozy a lot, but I think hopepunk is there because it doesn't have to be low stakes. Dark academia. It takes place in a school and it has dark vibes. You know, more mysterious, thriller, kind of atmospheric school vibes. The ones I hear the most when we talk about dark academia are probably things like Babel by R.F. Kuang, A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik, and like The Magicians probably by Lev Gossman. Okay, now we have sword and sorcery. Again, this is one I feel like kind of got replaced and I don't see it thrown around a ton, but it's definitely one I feel like that was more prominent to be talked about earlier on. Sword and sorcery is fantasy with swords. So it's not, gunpowder. But I think more in particular is that our main character is the sword wielder. They are a rogue, they are a barbarian. It is definitely following a fighter type. The kind of stories I think clearly are things like Conan the Barbarian. Okay, then we have steampunk, which often gets lumped in with urban fantasy, but steampunk is a very particular aesthetic that is trying to copy the Victorian era and like steam engines and steam technology. It is inspired by Victorian era industrialism. An example I've read is The Alchemist of Loom by Elise Kova. Okay, we're almost done. Next, litRPG. litRPG literally stands for literary role-playing game. However, this genre specifically focuses on online and digital role-playing games. So litRPG is a subset of fantasy in which the characters are involved in a digital world, a digital game. It's likely with litRPG you'll see things like stat blocks or some very clear game mechanic thing written into the book. I would say most famously, Ready Player One definitely is litRPG adjacent, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily like full litRPG. I think one of the most famous and traditional litRPGs would probably be Dungeon Crawler Carl. It's always a tongue twister. By Matt Dinneman. Okay, then we have progression fantasy, and progression fantasy is a little bit hard because people are kind of like, well, don't characters always progress? There are tons of stories where characters get stronger, and when is it progression and when is it not? From what I've seen and from how I've seen the term used, progression fantasy is specifically for books that have extremely measurable ways of leveling characters up, and that the primary reason or draw of the book itself is that leveling up mechanic. Additionally, problems in progression fantasies are solved by leveling up. That is how the problem is solved. The character needs to get stronger. So again, sometimes people kind of blend together litRPG and progression fantasy, but they are different because progression fantasy doesn't need any virtual world mechanics to be considered progression fantasy. I would say probably the most famous progression fantasy is Cradle by Will White. Finally, I'm going to talk about portal fantasy, and I don't hear the term portal a ton anymore, and I think it's mostly because so many of our fantasy books fall under portal fantasy that it doesn't feel like you really need to label them anymore. But portal fantasy is pretty simple. It's any fantasy that takes you from our world to a more magical world by some means. So many of our classic famous stories are portal novels. Narnia by C.S. Lewis, The Wizard of Oz, Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling, Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. I could go on and on and on. There are tons of examples. Okay, that's it. I went through most every fantasy term subgenre I could think of to cover that you might hear floating around. I hope this was helpful in some way. I am sure many of you will disagree with the general definitions I've provided here. Again, I'm not trying to be the one-all be-all, but to give you a general sense of when those terms are thrown around about a book, what it could generally mean. Because I do find that when you get in the book community, there's just a lot of terms you need to know. Anyway, tell me your opinion. Which subgenre do you tend to like best? Do you agree with me that we're kind of over-focused on genres sometimes and it doesn't really matter? Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.